All right, everybody. Welcome to Experience Talks. I am very happy today to have Betsy and David Quammen on the show. Betsy and David, welcome. I'm going to read, these are very brief bios, so there are longer versions of this that are links on the Experience Talks website at experiencetalks.org. So be sure and learn some more about these wonderful people. But here are who we are talking to today. Betsy Gaines Quammen is a historian, conservationist, and author of American Zion, Ammon Bundy, God and Public Lands in the West. She received a doctorate in environmental history from Montana State University and has studied various religious traditions over the years, with particular attention to how cultures view landscape and wildlife. The rural American West, pastoral communities of northern Mongolia, and the grasslands of East Africa have been her main areas of interest. Betsy lives in Bozeman, Montana with her husband, writer David Quammen, 2 huge dogs, an overweight cat, and a pretty big python named Boots that I'm gonna have to ask about in a little bit. So Betsy, welcome.
Thanks, Tim. It's so nice to be here.
David Quammen is an author and journalist whose 16 books include The Song of the Dodo, The Reluctant Mr. Darwin, and The Tangled Tree. His 2012 book, Spillover, Animal Infections and the Next Human Pandemic, described the dynamics of viral spillover from wildlife into humans and predicted a coming pandemic possibly caused by a coronavirus. Bad organ music in the background, scary organ music in the background there. Quammen's magazine work has appeared in the New Yorker, National Geographic, Harper's, The Atlantic, Rolling Stone, and the New York Review of Books, among other magazines, and his op-eds in the New York Times and other newspapers. He's a 3-time winner of the National Magazine Award and has received several awards for his books as well. Betsy and David, I'm very happy to have you on the show.
Tim, thank you. We're very glad to be with you.
We indeed are.
So can we start out by getting you guys to read a little bit, maybe a brief passage from one of each of your works? Does that sound good?
Yes.
You want to go first?
I will. I'm reading from American Zion, which is this guy.
Hold up the book.
Yeah. And this is the first chapter.
And you're not going to, you're starting at the first chapter. You're not going to read it.
I'm going to read the whole book.
You're going to read
isn't that what you're asking? No,
I'm
reading.
Already. It's like this.
I'm reading.
She reads really, really fast, David.
I'm reading 2.5 pages. I think I'll do it fast, but I think it'll be okay.
I think it'll be okay.
Yeah. Okay, the Battle of Bunkerville. The fight for freedom is God's fight. Ezra Taft Benson, who is a Mormon prophet. On April 12, 2014, hundreds of protesters, including members of various militia groups, gathered near Bunkerville, Nevada, in the southeastern corner of the state, making their stand in solidarity with Ammon Bundy. They had gathered to shut down the court-ordered removal of the Bundy's cattle from public land. Many in the crowd carried guns, and a few were positioned as snipers with rifles aimed at federal agents in the police. The agents aimed back. Men in cowboy hats rode on horseback, with a crowd pushing along to face Las Vegas police and the Bureau of Land Management officers. Some of the protesters threatened and yelled obscenities. One guy in a Pittsburgh Steelers jersey asked an officer if he was ready to die. Cliven and Carol Bundy told me that even a backfire could have triggered another Waco. Of course, militia members and the anti-government protesters say this all the time. Waco, Texas is a town where in 1993, federal agents, along with state law enforcement officers and the US military, led a siege of the compound in which the Branch Davidians had barricaded themselves. That siege ended in a final assault and a fire, resulting in the deaths of a dozen men, women, and children, an event that became a rallying cry in anti-government circles. Some allude to Waco as a cautionary tale, others with a kind of yearning, eager to have it out with the government they so despise. During the Bundy standoff, Interstate 15 was shut down while north and southbound traffic idled. On that spring day in Nevada, rifles aimed and ready, some of the protests awaited a sign that would determine the outcome. Would the feds attack first, giving the protesters their chance to defend the Bundys, to protect them from the evil forces responsible for the fate of the poor Branch Davidians of Waco? Or would the itchy fingers of an armed protest set up a volley of bullets? Perhaps divine intervention might take place, indicating God's sympathy for this Mormon rancher and his family. In the minds of the protesters there that day, all scenarios were possible. After a tense standoff, no bullets were exchanged. It was no Waco. In fact, the feds and the police relented and drove away. The retreat thrilled the protesters, but left officers and agents shaken. Sergeant Tom Jenkins of the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department said, "We didn't show any fear that day, but I can tell you, we all thought in the back of our minds, we all thought that was going to be our last day on earth." Although the law officers weren't interested in sacrificing their lives for cattle, many Bundy supporters were. Cliven's son, Ryan, declared to the crowd, "The West has now been won." Cliven Bundy, his family, and his followers reveled in the agent's retreat. "If the standoff with the Bundys was wrong," Cliven said later, "would the Lord have been with us? Could those people that stood there without fear and went through that spiritual experience have done that without the Lord being there? No, they couldn't." To the Bundys, the day validated their position and demonstrated that God was on their side.
Fantastic, Betsy. And just to put in a pitch, I finished the book last week, and I couldn't recommend it more to everyone out there. It's a fantastic book. And what I was telling Betsy off air before we started this is you did just such a great job delving deep into who these people are, who Cliven Bundy is, what he means, and where he comes from, to try and, so it would have been so easy to jump on the bandwagon of calling them crazy and coming from a place of trying not to understand them versus really going deep and trying to give us an understanding of where this stuff comes from. So, important book. Congratulations.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that.
Absolutely.
And it starts strong. Starts with a bang. Starts with a strong.
It does.
And you know, I was wrong. That wasn't, well, I have an introduction. So that was the first chapter.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm just going to read the last couple of chapters of my book. Okay, hold up the book, spill over. Mm-hmm. No, what I'm going to read is one page. And it does come from, this book I hope has an interesting beginning too, where horses are dying of a horrible infection. And people are trying to figure out why these horses are dying. But 500 pages later, after I've tracked through a number of the cases of emerging diseases, particularly emerging viruses that have come out of wildlife in the last 60 years and created disease and sometimes pandemic in humans, and also through the principles of this, which is a field called zoonotic diseases, animal infections transmissible to humans, and their potential for causing what I and others call the next big one, NBO, the next big one. At the end, as I'm pulling things together, I mentioned that I've talked to a number of scientists in the course of researching this book for 5 or 6 years. I talked to a number of experts in this field and asked them what they thought was coming. Would there be a next big one? And if so, what would it look like? And again, as Tim mentioned, this book was published in 2012. So I say this, in the science, some of them said, yes, there will be a next big one, and it will be a zoonotic disease. In the scientific literature, you find roughly the same kind of cautious, informed speculation. A highly regarded infectious disease epidemiologist named Donald S. Burke, presently Dean of the Graduate School of Public Health at the University of Pittsburgh, gave a lecture later published back in 1997, in which he listed the criteria that might implicate certain kinds of viruses as likeliest candidates to cause a new pandemic. Quote, the first criterion is the most obvious. Recent pandemics in human history, Burke told his audience then. That would point to the orthomyxoviruses, that's a family that includes the influenzas, and the retroviruses, a family that includes the HIVs, among others. And then another quote. The second criterion is proven ability to cause major epidemics in non-human animal populations, close quote. This would again spotlight the orthomyxoviruses, the influenza family, but also the family of paramyxoviruses, another family of viruses that includes Hendra and Nipah. One of those, Hendra, is the one that was causing this strange attack, killing horses in Australia. But also that family and the coronaviruses, such as that virus later known as SARS-CoV-2, or as we now call it, SARS-1. That's not in the book in 2012. Burke's third criterion was, quote, intrinsic evolvability, meaning readiness to mutate and to recombine, rearrange genomes in whole segments, which, quote, confers on a virus the potential to emerge into and to cause pandemics in human populations, close quote. As examples, Don Burke returned to the retroviruses, the orthomyxoviruses, and coronaviruses. This is all what he was saying, publishing in 1997. Quote, some of these viruses, he warned, citing coronaviruses in particular, should be considered as serious threats to human health. These are viruses with high evolvability and proven ability to cause epidemics in animal populations, close quote. It's interesting in retrospect to note that he had augured the SARS epidemic 6 years before it occurred. That one occurred in 2003. He was writing in 1997. Much more recently, again, this is me in 2012, much more recently, Burke told me, I made a lucky guess. He laughed a self-deprecating hoot and then added that, quote, prediction is too strong a word for what he had been doing. But it was pretty good prediction back then.
Yeah, scary stuff. And it's interesting because I loved your article, I think it was fall of last year in the New York Times Sunday Review section about bats and kind of coming from the point of view of the virus. And, you know, it's sense, I mean, I know that Stanley Fauci had talked about this, that the virus has only one mission and it's incalculably good at it.
Yeah. And I talk about that, I think in that time, I wrote 2 Times pieces. One was about bats and what's good about bats and why bats seem to be at the center of a number of these spillovers. And then another shorter op-ed, I think earlier, I did on the pandemic from the point of view of the virus.
Yeah.
I think I talked about what I call the 3 Darwinian imperatives. Viruses replicate with genomes. They have DNA, or some of them have RNA. The coronavirus is an RNA genome. They replicate with genomes, and therefore they are Darwinian creatures. They live in the Darwinian universe of evolution. And any creature that replicates with a genome is subject to what I call the 3 Darwinian imperatives. Have as many babies as possible.
Yep.
Replicate yourself as abundantly as possible. Make copies of yourself. Secondly, expand yourself in geographical space, colonize, go forth, fill the earth, find habitat. And third, extend yourself in time, persist, avoid extinction.
Yep.
And that's what viruses do.
Yeah.
And this one is pretty successful.
Sounds like Amazon.com kind of, if you look at it that way. Very similar idea. So I want to talk to both of you about what first inspired you to become writers, first off, and thinkers as attached to that. But also you both write about issues that are very important and very complex. So can each of you talk about what started you along this path and some ideas of how you've gone from there to here? Betsy, maybe you could start us out. Betty. Betsy, sorry about that.
No, okay. Don't. My best friends call me Betty. It's my nickname, and I kind of like it.
I'm spreading it out geographically.
Now the world knows. Betty.
Yeah.
I just cloned you. You have a sister named Betty.
I'm sure she's delightful. Anyway, let's see. Okay. First of all, I kind of don't think of myself as a writer, not like David. I mean, I came to American Zion through my interest in conservation. And it actually was my dissertation. I did my PhD. I got a PhD in environmental history. And I had been working with religious organizations for years on conservation issues and found that religious perspectives really help a community or inform a community on how they perceive landscape and wildlife. And I'd worked primarily in Mongolia and Bhutan. I doing this work, and then I worked in the Western United States, which is where I live, and so I became also interested in how religion can inform communities in a way that's not embracing of conservation principles. And I should say that the Bundys do not represent the Mormon Church. They are not indicative of Mormon culture. In fact, the Mormon Church has issued environmental edicts supporting the care of creation, which is how they would term it. But the Bundys were really interesting to me, and Mormon culture in Southern Utah and Southern Nevada, because I noticed that these land use wars, which had gone on, and I don't know how familiar people are with the Sagebrush Rebellion, but there have been these ongoing conflicts over public land in regards to mining, logging, and grazing, and it's been ongoing for a long time. And so this tension between conservation and utilization of landscape. And so when I went and began my work on American Zion, I really was looking at how communities interpret landscape through a religious point of view, because I found that these land use wars were particularly vitriolic in what is considered Mormon homeland. And I talk about that in the book. So but I should say I am writing my next book. So I kind of have started to like the idea of being a writer.
And don't tell your publisher that you don't think of yourself as a writer.
Well, I never, because you're a writer. I don't know. I'm more of just, I like stories. But
okay,
I don't.
I'll dub over the answer and just have you say, I love writing. I've never.
but no, I think there's a difference. I mean, I'm kind of an activist.
There's one difference. You say this is your dissertation, but it's a much adapted version of your dissertation.
It is,
it does not
Thank
read
God.
Does not read folks like a dissertation. It reads like
not at all.
like a riveting, lively book of Western history and thought.
I saw both your TED Talks too, and your two TED Talks are nicely balanced around that issue too. And I had never thought about the idea of conservation from a point of view of religion and cultural place. So I love the way you talk about that stuff.
So you said, wow, then you must have seen my religion and conservation TED Talk.
That's a great one. Yeah. I love the idea of how we can't accomplish conservation simply from tagging. We have to get further into the landscape by virtue of getting to the people, and by getting to the people, you need to get back to people's cultural roots and how they perceive land and animals.
Yeah.
I think you're one of the only people who's seen that TED Talk. I did a TED Talk.
I saw it.
Did you see it? I did one on the Bundys too years later, but I'm so glad I like that little talk. Anyway, great. David, the writer.
So my story is a little different. I have wanted to be a writer since 1959. At which point,
who was your first inspiration? Name a writer that said, David, you must become a writer.
Probably, let's see, Robert Service.
Yeah. There are strange things done in the midnight sun.
Oh, don't get me started, Tim. Don't be careful. Don't get me started.
I've seen the David and Betsy show. I've seen you get started.
Yeah. So you know the triggers.
So I was always interested in two things. I was always interested in writing, putting words together, making shapes with words, writing plays, writing stories, writing poems, writing songs. But I had zero musical talent. As evidenced by the fact that I played banjo. and I was always interested in the natural world. So, and I had some great English teachers, and I had some good biology teachers. And so I tipped toward the writing side, toward the literature side for years. And then after graduate school, I moved to Montana and took graduate courses in zoology for the first time, and circled back toward the natural world. And also, I had started my writing career as a fiction writer, published a few novels, and then concluded that that was not meant to be my niche. I was a middle-class white male from a happy childhood in Ohio. Who needs that person to be a novelist?
Not enough darkness in your life.
No, there wasn't, no. So I turned to nonfiction, and when I turned to nonfiction, I turned back to the natural world and started writing first what I suppose would be called natural history essays, but quickly I got interested enough in science, in ecology, including theoretical ecology, population biology, evolutionary biology, Darwin, and ecology, evolutionary biology, and conservation. That's one of our overlaps, important overlap. That became my journalistic beat and also my authorial. When I wrote books, that's what I wrote them about mostly.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
And then when it came to infectious diseases, emerging diseases, I got interested in Ebola virus because I was walking across the Congo with a crazy explorer, wonderful crazy explorer, and we walked through Ebola habitat, and I read up on that and got very fascinated as well as scared by that, and by the dynamics of Ebola living somewhere in the forest in this reservoir host, the animal, the unidentified animal in which Ebola virus lives when it's not making humans sick and killing them. And I realized that this question was all about ecology and evolutionary biology. So when I saw that emerging viruses were a subject in ecology and evolutionary biology, and I said, okay, that's a fit. I need to write about that.
And it had to have seemed really important at the time too. I mean, we have seen this coming obviously for quite some time now.
Well, it did, yeah. At first, that was in '99 and 2000 that I was doing that walk across the Congo. So my interest dates back to then. But then in 2006, National Geographic asked me to do a story on these diseases that come from animal hosts and get into humans. And then that quickly turned into a book project. And as I did more research on it, I realized that this was much bigger than Ebola. Ebola is a terrible, frightful disease that has killed tens of thousands now of people in Africa, mostly rural people in Africa, poor rural people in Africa. Yeah. But even in 2014, it was clear to those of us who studied this at all that Ebola was not the next big one. Ebola, even during the scary, horrible epidemic in 3 West African countries, it was clear that Ebola was not the one.
right? It wasn't spreading.
It has the wrong characteristics to be a global pandemic. Yep. But there are other things like the coronaviruses and the influenza viruses that did have that potential, and that obviously do have that potential. And
yeah. Yeah. When we were emailing earlier today, David, you came up with this two-word explanation for where we might go today. Infection and insurrection. I love that. You guys are like Nancy Drew and the Hardy Boys. Infection and insurrection. So let's start on the insurrection side, because and interestingly, what an amazing way to describe 2020.
Well, and I should say that phrase, infection and insurrection, Betsy owns that. That may be a subtitle of one of your forthcoming talks or your book.
Oh, I think it was, it's something that, well, because this year was so weird, and because I couldn't go on the book tour for American Zion, which came out, we did a number of talks, and I think we entitled one "Infection and Insurrection," and we may have that might have been one too that I was bouncing off Jody, who's joining us today too. So just it was something that we've spent a ton of time thinking about, because boy, did they get wrapped up in each other.
Yes.
Yeah. This past year especially. So starting on the insurrection side with your work on understanding the Bundy incident, I would assume there are very easily parallels to be made between that incident and like incidents and the reaction to what happened with our government in the last year, with the storming of the Capitol, the insanity around trying to disprove the facts of the election. What do you see in terms of parallels to and where does this come from? Where does this insurrectional, our idea is much different than yours, and we're willing to attack to protect it?
Yes. Okay. So this is, I'm going to give as concise an answer as I can, because there's a lot to say about that particular question. Ammon Bundy, who is Cliven Bundy's son, was the architect of a takeover in Oregon at the Malheur Wildlife Refuge, and he had gone there, and I won't go into the full story, but he had gone there on behalf of a father and son who had just been put in jail for arson, lighting a fire on public lands that imperiled a number of firefighters, and he broke away and did this takeover occupation for 41 days. And since then, he's really been looking for his next big cause. What is it that he, again, as I mentioned when I was reading this book, what is God telling him what to do in terms of protecting liberty? And there's a very long Mormon history about the role of a Mormon person or people defending liberty as a constitution hangs by a thread. That's a prophecy that's been kicked around by these right-wing Mormon adherents. And so when COVID hit, and Brad Little, who was is the governor of Idaho, although Ammon Bundy is now running for governor himself. So when that happened, Brad Little had to deal with a very large outbreak in Sun Valley, which is in Blaine County, and they were hit hard right off the bat. Their medical facilities were overwhelmed, and he was one of the first Western governors to, and I by West, I mean Intermountain West, to really implement COVID protocols, such as, no large gatherings. It was before masks, but they wanted businesses to take it very seriously, and it was this kind of idea of churches not being able to meet. So I talked to Ammon, and back in March of 2020, because I thought this is pushing all of his buttons. It's whether it's the government protecting endangered species and therefore asking his father to either retire his grazing permit or to reduce the number of cows, affront to liberty. COVID protocols, affront to liberty, gun control, affront to liberty. You have these buttons that are pushed. And lo and behold, this became his next malheur. And he became a very big anti-mask agitator. He created the People's Rights Network, which is the militia. I'm trying to think, like the people who track militia, and the American Defamation League and some of these other organizations have dubbed this Ammon's Army. He says that he has 50,000 adherents or people who have signed up for these. It's really terrifying. And
they're just waiting for their next.
They're waiting for their next thing. And it's going to shift back to resource issues. Right now in the Klamath Basin, Ammon Bundy is involved with a group of farmers who are very angry because there's no water. And the state of California is trying to protect the water resource, and the farmers in that area want the water for irrigation, and Ammon's very involved in that. And so he's got an army that was really galvanized by mask mandates and COVID protocols. And now he's going to go back into resource feuds, public lands or water or whatever next big issue, because this is something that is his raison d'etre. This is something he really sees himself as a religiously mandated protector of liberty.
Yeah. Yeah. And David, playing into that from your side, I mean, it's so interesting how the crossover, now it gets into your territory around the science of how do we battle a virus, and how do you battle a virus with science when God is telling people whether they should wear masks or not.
Right. Yeah. Actually, two things that it raises on my side of this picture, Tim. One is the fact that from the beginning, it was clear that this pandemic was going to raise, at best, a serious discussion, at worst, serious conflict between civil liberties and public health.
Yeah.
And some people construe civil liberties in a very broad sense, the sense that, by God, I'm an American and I can do any damn thing that I want to. And my rights don't end where your nose begins.
Yep.
My rights are virtually infinite. So that's the extreme Western sort of cowboy ethic version of civil liberties. And I was very attuned to that because that's what Betsy's book is about.
Yeah.
We talk about that all the time, and she studies that. To a lesser degree of conflict, it was clear to me that there would be at best a discussion between the imperatives of legitimate civil liberties and the imperatives of public health, because they do conflict to a certain degree. There are things that you may need to do during a pandemic that constrain your freedom to walk into a public building without a mask, your freedom to walk into a government building, your courthouse without a mask. So that's civil liberties in conflict with public health. There is also this conflict between science as scientists understand it, which is a process that moves toward greater understanding through a process of observation, experiment, hypothesis testing, falsification of hypotheses, gathering of further evidence, improvement of hypotheses, correction, self-correction, clearer understanding. Nowhere in that definition did I use the word truth.
Yeah, truth and proof are words that I think are greatly misunderstood in the scientific community, right?
Right, and scientists generally don't use the word truth. But now everybody is a researcher. Everybody is an independent researcher. Everybody who's got one of these things, who can Google the word coronavirus, can Google the words lab leak, everybody is a researcher now, everybody. And so there are a lot of amateurs. God help us, people even more amateurish in molecular virology than I am. Thousands of them out there doing their independent research, forming strong opinions, throwing those opinions up on Twitter, criticizing scientists, demonizing scientists, and persuading other people that because I'm an independent researcher and I found a website that says such and such, blah, 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 therefore I have evidence that such and such happened.
Yep.
I mean, when I was researching, 10, 15 years ago, when I was researching spillover, at one point I wondered, and this was before the 2014 Ebola events in West Africa, I wondered how many people in total have died of Ebola virus? And I thought, okay, there was the Yambuku outbreak, there was the Kikwit outbreak, there was the outbreak at Bundi Bugyo in Uganda, and I could, I knew these events pretty familiarly. There was the Mayabut 2 outbreak in northeastern Gabon, and let's see, 200 here, 64 there, 31 there, 197 there, and I estimated maybe at that point in 2012, 800 or 900 people had died of Ebola virus since it was first identified in 1976. So I wonder what the internet says. So I go on the internet and I Google how many Ebola deaths. First things that comes up is a website. It says Ebola is one of the 10 most lethal diseases in history. 200,000 people have died.
Wow.
It was a young high school student in the California Valley. It was her website. And she had just decided that 200,000 people had died of Ebola. And she put this up. And it was, I think, the first thing that came up on Google.
That's scary.
That's the world that we live in even more extremely now. There is all this stuff out there that people are mistaking for factual information.
And I would also add, I mean, I think that we have the internet, which is a morass of misinformation, and, and people can, people tend to believe what reflects their own values. So if they have no trust in science, they have no trust in experts, and the Bundys had that. I mean, it really played on existing cultural biases. Mm-hmm. Am I saying that right? Mm-hmm. Yep. And so you already have a group of people in this country who already don't like what science is telling them, whether it's, the fact that we have a climate problem or the fact that endangered species don't do well with grazing. That
humans evolved from a different form of life.
Well, although I will say the Mormon church embraces evolution. So I'm talking a little bit more about the Bundys, but yes. So you already have a culture that doesn't believe in science. Now you have this culture under shelter in place orders. They're lonely, they're isolated, they're confused. This is a disease that no one at this point understands. And as you say, science is evolving. They're not arriving at truths. They're just trying to figure out what's going on. So they're doing their own research. They're finding sites that reflect their own values. Lab leak, they're lying to us. They're overcounting the number of people dead, which is what Ammon told me. Then add to that, you have no leadership. So the president of our United States at that time,
what was that guy's name?
He was, it's a hoax. It's a Democratic, and I'm not saying Trump said that directly, but his administration, this is a Democratic plot. It'll go away by spring. All these things. So we didn't have leadership. We were isolated. We had a place to have our own values reflected to us in the form of misinformation. And we were terrified and we were lonely.
Yeah, nature abhors a vacuum. It creates chaos, and chaos is what we got at the end of the day.
Yeah. And Ammon was able to benefit from that because he's had so many people now join in. And so we also see these very interesting layers of we have the militia people, and we have the anti-vax people, and we have the pro-Trump people, and the Stop the Steal people, and the QAnon people, and they're all, you know, they all came together right before the election. And as the insurrection was happening in DC, I was watching all these people join. They were all networking, which is what you can do online. And obviously we couldn't do it in person because we weren't getting together. But the insurrection made so much sense because all these groups came together with their various gripes. But they knew one thing for certain, you know, the government, there'd been a vote that had been stolen and Trump was their guy. Because even though Ammon Bundy wasn't a big Trump supporter, his coalition were huge Trump supporters. And so it kind of came together under the umbrella of Trump and a distrust in the election.
So from that perspective, I mean, we talked earlier about the idea of human behavior and where we go with this thing. Is there a way to bridge the divide? I mean, the combination of both your expertise is so interesting to me, because we talked about the concept of truth. And I know, David, that science does not necessarily use truth as a word, but the idea of trusting science and having that kind of morph over into trusting government. And, you know, we've heard rumors that Bill Gates wants to fund the vaccine so that he can insert a microchip into people and study their behavior.
Yeah, that always strikes me as odd, because people are concerned, oh, if I get vaccinated, Bill Gates's people, they're going to put a chip in me and they know where I'm going all the time. And I like to remind people, if you have this, they already know where you're going.
You carry it around with you. Yep. So from both, David, you mentioned Darwin and Betsy talking about the kind of the mindset of the insurrectionist. What would Darwin say about this in terms of from a human evolution standpoint? We're very much our own worst enemy at times. So what do we do about that? How do we try and find some way to talk to each other to get to a place where we might evolve through this?
Yeah, that's a tough one. Well, first of all, let me say a couple of words on behalf of poor Mr. Darwin. I'm sure he would be appalled and fascinated to be part of our world now. He's been gone since 1883, 1882. Anyway, one of the wonderful, important things about Charles Darwin, one of the things that made him a great scientist and a great man, is that he knew the limits of his knowledge. He knew what he knew, and he knew which things he didn't know. He knew which questions his methodology answered and which questions his methodology did not answer. For instance, when people asked him, you know, are you an atheist? No, I can't say I'm an atheist because I can't. I like Huxley's word, agnostic. I don't know. I don't know whether there's a God or not. How can I know whether there's a God or not by studying the shapes of tortoise shells from the Galapagos? And unlike some people, he did not believe that design in nature proved the existence of a God. That's what his great work was all about, providing an alternate explanation to that explanation. But likewise, people would say, what's the origin of life? Darwin would say, I don't know. What I know is once life appeared on Earth, I have a theory that explains the arising of complexity, diversity, and adaptation. We call that evolution. But who lit the spark? How the spark lit itself? I don't know. My methods don't answer that question. Darwin was good at that. He was good at knowing what he knew and knowing where the limits were.
One of the things I loved about your book, The Reluctant Mr. Darwin, is talking about the effect that his wife's religiousness had on his work and his releasing his work, because he was obviously very sensitive to the fact that he knew that his work would have a profound effect on their place in his wife's religious community.
He was a gentleman, full of radical ideas, or as I say, probably somewhere in that book, he was a fundamentally conservative man who found himself burdened with an extremely radical idea. And he was so honest, so fundamentally intellectually honest, that he could not but develop and present that idea. And at the same time, throughout his entire married life, he knew that his wife was a very conventional Anglican, and that it hurt her to think that he was a non-believer. Where was his soul going to go? What was going to happen to Charles after death? It hurt her, and it hurt him to realize that it hurt her. So he was the gentlest radical who ever lived.
You know, and thinking about Charles Darwin right now and trying to make sense of where we are, it makes me think of Joseph Smith and how right now it's a prophet would really benefit. I think Darwin would be daunted and sort of disappointed with what's happening right now. But this has been a time of chaos. I mean, like the Second Great Awakening, where it was a time of prophets who came and tried to make sense to people who were living amidst poverty and various other. There was the idea of colonializations, and we were in the process of building this nation, of course, and genocide of Native Americans, but the idea of prophets emerging in this moment for people to turn to explain what's happening. And I think that's why QAnon has been so successful, why we have seen people who have absolutely bought these lies, hook, line, and sinker, because there's a certain comfort that comes in the form of a prophet, rather than say a Darwin who really was trying to come to terms with, as you said, these radical ideas that really challenged people. People did not want to be challenged by ideas right now.
The Black Death, bubonic plague in the 14th century in Europe, a third of Europe's population dying of a disease that no one understood. And if I recall correctly, my memory for Barbara Tuchman's great book on the 14th century is not clear enough, but a breeding ground for prophets to arise, saying, amidst this misery, amidst this confusion, amidst this horror, amidst this dark mystery, I have answers, I have explanations.
Yeah. It's not a crazy idea that Ammon Bundy could end up being elected in this day and age. I mean, we've got some pretty crazy people in elected positions right now that have some nutty ideas.
Certainly not far-fetched that Ammon Bundy could be elected governor of Idaho.
It's not. Right now, I think there's something wrong with his paperwork that they're trying to sort out. But I mean, the United States had radical elements before COVID, but the radicalization and the speed to which people have been radicalized has been jaw-dropping. If you had asked me a year ago if there'd be an insurrection at the Capitol, I don't think I could have visualized it. But by last September or October, I thought this is absolutely going to happen, because people were talking about it quite openly. I mean, one of Ammon's associates is Stuart Rhodes, who is the founder of Oath Keepers, and was extremely instrumental in it's looking like that more and more in the insurrection. Now, Ammon wasn't in DC, but after the insurrection happened, there were some talk radio programs that interviewed Cliven, his father, and Cliven said, "Why did they leave? Why didn't they just stay in the Capitol once they were in the Capitol?" I mean, he was approving of the action. He just didn't think that they tried hard enough.
They took it far enough. Yeah, that's the scariest part is somehow it dissipated and imagine if it hadn't, if they had gone the same route as Waco and Clive and Bundy, what if it had become, we're not going to leave.
Well, and they're ready for violence now. Ammon's talking about it quite openly, that they are ready for violence. And this Klamath Basin issue, they have, as I said, this is a place that's run out of water. The farmers want the water. They have locked the gates. One of the farmers has bought a property adjacent to these floodgates, and they're gathering people right now. Yeah,
yeah. So I want to shift directions a little bit toward we're getting near the end here. The name of the show is Experience Talks, and one of the things we like to talk about is the idea of experience and its value in society, and like to ask guests, as you get older, as you gain judgment and experience in your life, how that changes your perspective on your work, your life, where you're headed, your sense of purpose and value. For each of you, what is it like as you continue to log laps around the sun and gain experience and wisdom?
Maybe I should go first on this one because I'm the old guy.
Well, I'm eager to hear what you have to say. You're not that.
I had, when I turned 60, 13 years ago, it seemed like a scary number to me. Now it doesn't seem like a scary number. I am very, I love my work. I realize that I have a finite amount of time to do more of it. I want it to be meaningful. I want to choose my book projects and my digressions from books to do magazine articles or op-eds carefully. I don't want to waste my time or have my time wasted. My college roommates are all retired and playing golf and sailing their boats. Not all of them, but most of them. And God bless them. I occasionally get to recreate with them a little bit, but I'm working harder than I have ever worked in my life. Is that bad? Am I complaining? No, I love it. I love my work so much. And I've got so many books still to read and a handful of books still that I'd like to write, that I'm blessed by the fact that I am not going to run out of work before I run out of time. And given the degree to which I love my work, and feel that it gives my life meaning, that makes me pretty happy.
That's great.
Yeah, I just want to echo that. I've been thinking a lot about it because right now we're at a pretty rough time. I mean, I think it's important, as we emerge from this pandemic, I'm not sure if we're fully going to emerge from this pandemic ever. I guess pandemic is different than COVID, just hot spots.
Yeah.
But I do feel daunted by the many things that we're facing right now. And I'm really worried about our democracy, very worried. However, I just gave a commencement speech to a high school in town, a small experiential education school, and these kids are so engaged, and they understand that there are issues that they need to grapple with that generations before this generation have created, and I was trying to think of something to tell them as they go out in the world, what might be important to keep in mind as they do have to fight these battles and face these ugly truths. And I think David hit the nail on the head that it's joy. I mean, no matter what we're working on, no matter how daunting the issue, we have to come at it with joy. We have to love what we're doing. And I think David and I are incredibly lucky because even as we face these grim realities, you know, working in pandemics or working in you know, insurrection and militia agitation, we really do it with a joy that comes from acknowledging there are things fraught in the world and doing our best to both explain them and to help people do better jobs at both understanding them and potentially tackling them.
It's fantastic. What a terrific experience.
Can I add one other thing, Tim?
Sure, yeah, you can.
Another thing that has occurred to me as being very important, and I mention it sometimes when young people say, hey, how do I become a writer? I want to be, you know, I want to have your career. You know, a number of people hear that, oh, I want to have your career. I want to have your job. How do I get there? So I get that question too. Or simply question from young people, you know, how might I become a professional writer? This is something that I say to them, but I think it's also applicable generally to people as they make their career choices, as they make those important choices about how to live their lives. And it's this: among all the other decisions that you make, take some risk. Take some goddamn risk.
Yep.
Because if you live a risk-free life, you probably will not have the same satisfaction or reach as far for value as you might have otherwise. There is no risk-free route to independent achievement or to finding value or to making your life and the lives of others better. Take some risk.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Yeah, I think we have to learn to fail to learn to succeed, right? You know, failure is a much better educator.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, thank you both very much. I've enjoyed this immensely.
Thank you so much. We have too.
Yeah.
Thank you for having us, Tim.
Yeah.
Continued good luck. I love both of your books. It's been a real pleasure to talk to you. I appreciate you doing this.
Thank you so much. Great pleasure talking to you.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.